MBTA.com.
I'm Craig Lamolt. Tonight on Greater Boston, local lawmakers are hoping to work with MBTA Police to keep extremists out of Boston's St. Patrick's Day Parade and prevent the kind of hate that was on display last year. Then 3 years of the pandemic. We'll dig into what we've lost, what we've learned, and how far we still have to go with a pair of local infectious disease doctors. Ahead of this annual St. Patrick's Day Parade in South Boston, local lawmakers are looking to keep hate out of the festivities. The kind of hate that was on full display at last year's parade, when members of the white supremacist group NSC 131 hung a banner that read, "Keep Boston Irish." They also defaced public property on the T and in the city with hateful propaganda, according to Congressman Stephen Lynch, City Council President Ed Flynn, and other local leaders who sent a letter to the chief of the MBTA Transit Police urging them to collaborate on a security plan to keep what happened last year from happening again. Council President Ed Flynn joins me now, as does GBH News senior investigative reporter Phillip Martin, who's been covering white supremacy in Massachusetts extensively. Thank you both so much for being here.
It's good to be with you.
Phillip, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit what happened at last year's parade?
Well, last year's parade, I think people were surprised. Tens of thousands of people showed up in South Boston for the annual parade, and suddenly you have about 24 members of NSC 131, a neo-Nazi group, standing as the parade would go by with a huge banner in front of the parade goers and those who were taking part in the floats and so on and so forth, with a banner that says, "Keep Boston Irish." And it was something that was absolutely surprising to a number of people. And at that point, you found two people who were this was live tweeted, and they saw this. This is the filmmaker Rod Weber and Lauren Pespisa. They're local anti-fascist activists. They climbed in their, jumped in their car, came down to the demonstration, and started demonstrating. They came down to the parade, I should say, and started demonstrating as a couple and asking others to join in. Some people, and then suddenly people started denouncing. They started realizing what was going on, and they started denouncing these individuals. They started to leave some of the footage you just saw is them leaving the parade after they were being shouted at. And Weber and his colleague followed Lauren Pespisa, and were harassing these individuals. But essentially, the bottom line is they had a presence at this parade, and it angered a lot of people, angered them so much that the following week, there was a counter demonstration in which they had actually, NSC 131 had actually challenged the band, the Dropkick Murphys, to show up at this park in South Boston. The Dropkick Murphys were there along with many supporters, but NSC 131 did not show up. Anyway, this became a huge international story, as you know.
Right, and I want to ask Council President, you've written, and other public officials have written this letter calling for the MBTA police to step in. Why the MBTA? Why reach out to them? What can they do to address this?
Well, you are correct. We reached out to the MBTA police. We also reached out to Boston Police and the state police as well. We are meeting with all three of the departments very soon. But they do use the MBTA system to get from one location. I think it's somewhere outside of Medford or Malden, that area the last time, and to get into the city through the MBTA system. But also it's about working closely with Boston Police, MBTA Police, State Police. There really should be zero tolerance. There's no room at all in this city for this white supremacist group or any hate group. And we've seen a lot of these demonstrations here in the most progressive city in the country. And we've seen at various hospitals, colleges and universities. We've seen anti-LGBTQ demonstrations. We've seen attacks on the Jewish community, immigrant community. So here in Boston, we need to stand together, acknowledge that we have problems just like every other major city, but we're also a city that respects our immigrant roots, and we want to make sure we have that when we have an event, it's inclusive, it's safe, and it's welcoming for all.
One last thing on the MBTA call specifically is, what ability does the MBTA have to control who rides their trains?
I think the MBTA police will want to know when these Nazis or white supremacists are using the MBTA to get from one location to the other location. It's also about coordinating resources, knowing that when they get off a stop, that another police department should be aware of their presence in and around a particular neighborhood. What they're doing is they're trying to divide residents, they're trying to intimidate people, and they're trying to hurt people through this hate message and through violence. And I think the people throughout Greater Boston are not going to stand for it. And as an elected official, I think every elected official across the state needs to stand up and speak out against these, I call them thugs, that are intimidating people across our state. So I'm confident that our public safety resources will be coordinated appropriately for this upcoming parade.
To that point, Phillip, if these protesters, if these white supremacists do have signs again like they did last year, what ability, if any, does the Boston Police Department have to do anything about it?
I think there's the issue of free speech. I think that's the bottom. That's the part of the question you're getting to,
right?
Greg. And the right to assembly. But there's also questions of intimidation, and which fall within a legal, that become part of a legal concern: intimidation, harassment. And if parade goers feel that they are being intimidated, harassed, and they don't have to prove intimidation, by the way, as a legal standard, but if they feel that they're being intimidated, harassed, police can play a role. I'm not sure about. I don't know the intricacies of the law such that whether or not they can take their signs away, so on and so forth. But I think that they can, in fact, they have the ability to address the situation if people feel harassed and intimidated. And if you have individuals with swastikas on and skull masks, and they're basically directing their animus toward, as Council Flynn said, Jews and people of color, Asians, LGBTQ communities, there is an understandable concern on the part of those who might be taking part in that parade that they are being intimidated and harassed.
Right.
And that becomes a reason for some type of action on the part of the police, the U.S. attorney even, and local law enforcement officials.
Council President, is there a risk of infringing on the freedom of speech of these white supremacists?
I don't think so. I certainly support the First Amendment, but when that First Amendment is used as a way to intimidate people, cause hate, cause violence, that's when the First Amendment for me is not applicable in that situation, because then these Nazis are using this opportunity to create division, to create violence, to create hate crimes. And Phillip is right. I also have talked to the U.S. Attorney, Rachel Rollins, several times about this over the years. I know she's very concerned and is on top of this situation, and she's provided excellent leadership. I also think this is a violation of civil rights, which makes it a federal jurisdiction. So it's about city, state, and even the federal government working together to ensure that every city is inclusive and everyone is treated with respect.
Phillip, what is happening here? Why are we hearing more from these groups? Are they growing in size, or are they becoming more vocal? What your reporting has really looked at what's going on with white supremacy and these kinds of hate groups. What's going on?
They've experienced some growth, yes, but that's not the main thing. The main thing is they feel emboldened. There's an they feel that they can amplify, and they have had success amplifying the mainstream concerns of many within the far right of the Republican Party. That is why they have targeted transgender people, have targeted LGBTQ, have targeted so-called critical race theory and what that represents. The difference between the on-the-ground extremists like NSC 131 and some within the Republican Party who are on the far right is that the latter still employ dog whistles. NSC 131 is very explicit with their anti-Semitism, very explicit with their racism, but they're amplifying issues that are part of this so-called culture war that has been embraced by, sadly, by many within, again, the far right flank of the Republican Party. And thus you see, and that is not to say that you'll see members of the Republican Party hanging banners from a highway imploring people to be concerned about white individuals, about white people. But you do hear within the Republican Party amplification of the great replacement theory, so-called, that white people are being replaced by immigrants and others in some mad scheme to displace white people within the United States. That's something that Tucker Carlson talks about often. It's something that's been amplified by Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and others within the Republican Party. So what you're seeing is an amplification of again, cultural themes by extremists. In other words, the mainstreaming of extremism. And it's not just NSC 131 that is of concern to many people. It is the Patriot Front. They have established a presence here. It is a group called the Base. It is the Proud Boys in New Hampshire. And it's also the reason, I should add, that the Attorney General of New Hampshire and others within mainstream law enforcement have pressed charges against NSC 131, civil rights violations for hanging this banner, hanging banners in New Hampshire, feeling that this was not a question of, as Councilman Flynn said, of freedom of speech or assembly. This is a question of hate speech and a violation of civil rights, and thus they took a step to address it.
Council President, you have a meeting next week, I think you said, with city and state officials and law enforcement to address safety at the parade. What do you expect, what do you hope is going to come from that?
That we coordinate and exchange ideas on how to make sure that this parade is inclusive, it's safe, that people that do come to the parade have an enjoyable time, but they aren't intimidated by hate groups that come to this parade to divide people, to cause havoc, to cause violence and intimidation. That's not what our city's about. This is an inclusive city, and it's important that everyone is treated fairly in Boston. But we want to make sure and acknowledge that we have, as Phillip said, extreme hateful groups throughout Massachusetts, throughout New England, and we have to acknowledge it, but we also have to deal with it. And it's not going away. It continues to happen. It's happened at the Children's Hospital, Beth Israel Hospital, the Holocaust Memorial. These same Nazi groups have marched right through the downtown area, right through the Chinatown area, intimidating AAPI communities. And Phillip is right. I think this hateful speech started under or was enhanced under President Trump. It continues today. And I think it's important that we come together as a country, acknowledge it, but to deal with it and to make sure that we always treat our immigrant community with respect and dignity. I think that's the important part. It's easy to intimidate people during a pandemic, especially the immigrant community, and that's exactly what President Trump has done, in my opinion.
Okay, well, Council President Ed Flynn and Phillip Martin, thank you both so much for joining us to talk about this.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
Next up, it's been 3 years, nearly to the day, since the World Health Organization first declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. In the years since, we've witnessed immeasurable loss, as more than 6 million people around the world have died, along with an astounding innovation as well, as scientists race to develop vaccines, which have reached billions of people and no doubt saved countless lives. These days, much of the world has returned to a version of pre-pandemic normal, heading back in person to work and school, restaurants, concerts, etc., with many leaders, including President Joe Biden, declaring the pandemic essentially over. But hundreds of people are still dying of COVID every day in the U.S. alone, and millions are living with long-term symptoms after they've stopped testing positive for the virus. To look back at the last 3 years of COVID and the lessons we should take with us into the next few years, I'm joined by Dr. Cassandra Pierre, Medical Director of Public Health and Programs at Boston Medical Center, and Dr. Paul Sachs, Clinical Director of the Division of Infectious Diseases at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Dr. Cassandra Pierre and Dr. Paul Sachs, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Thank you for inviting us. Yes, 3 years have gone by very quickly, that's for sure.
You know, it's funny you say that, because I was thinking it's been a long 3 years. I feel like somehow it's both seem to be true. You know, when I look back at what those early days were like, it's sort of an amazing thing to think about, and I'm wondering what your experiences were like in the beginning as everything changed virtually overnight. Starting with you, Dr. Pierre, can you just sort of remind us, for you, what things were like and what things were like in your hospital?
Absolutely, and I agree that time was elastic, and both feels like a second and 10 decades have passed by. Yeah. It was chaotic, predictably. It was also clarifying. I felt like I was connected to my purpose, which is to prevent infections. And so it was a series of, long meetings, coming together with our department or section or hospital to figure out what we needed to do to get the right PPE, to protect our patients, and figure out how to do what we needed to do to take care of our community.
Dr. Sachs, what was it like for you in those early days?
Yeah, I agree entirely, but I also say it was heartbreaking too. I think one of the really difficult parts about it, we're seeing people in the hospital who couldn't be visited by their family and friends. It's something that will always stick with me, the sense of isolation that the people with COVID-19 in the hospital at that time had. And it was, as I said, heartbreaking, and something I hope we never have to go back to.
I mean, things got pretty bleak here in Massachusetts, as they did around the country, around the world. For each of you, what were the darkest days? When was it at its worst, and what was that like? Dr. Pierre, for you, what do you remember from those toughest moments?
And there's a series of low points, but I think one of the things that really stuck out to me is that one of the first few patients, a series of first few patients, were pregnant women. And certainly have visuals of women remaining in ICUs long after their babies were born, weeks to maybe even months. And that was terrible. And to the extent that we could have anticipated anything, nothing that we anticipated. Also seeing young and previously healthy people dying. So I would say probably earliest in the pandemic, when the confusion was highest, and the tragedy was also really just palpable, and within our lives as well.
Dr. Sachs, what were those toughest moments for you?
Well, part of it was figuring out really how to move forward. I'm married to a primary care pediatrician, and her practice had to shut down, which is very unusual for pediatricians. Meanwhile, I was going into the hospital each day and not really knowing how to best manage the patients was very hard. People were looking to infectious disease specialists for answers, but we, of course, didn't have any at the time. It was a very difficult time. I think all of us have some degree of post-traumatic stress disorder related to it. And one thing that has been good is coming together of the infectious disease community really to support each other during that period.
Yeah. We're at a very different time now. I mean, it's important to remember that COVID is not done, right? We're not done with COVID-19. but things feel very different right now, and a lot's changed. I'm wondering if you could speak to some of the things that have changed over the last 3 years. I mean, there's testing and therapeutics and vaccination. What are some of to you, the most significant changes that have happened, and how is really the world different now than it was 3 years ago this day? Dr. Pierre?
I don't think we can underscore the importance of vaccines. And of course, there's other factors like a collective infection-derived immunity, but really vaccines was our first light of hope in this. And so I really can't underscore it. Currently, I would say, though, for people who remain at high risk for severe complications, I think one of the things that brings me the greatest satisfaction is talking through with my patients or others a plan. What is going to be their therapeutic plan? What is the treatment that exists? And for some people, that light hasn't even gone off. The thought that they can prepare for what the worst might be if they remain medically vulnerable. So that's been incredibly gratifying.
One of the things I wanted to ask you both about is the fact that, I mean, for people who lost someone to the pandemic, clearly, life will never be the same. But also for people who did get the virus, a lot of them continue to have symptoms. There was a study in the U.S. In the publication Nature Communications from data from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs that said that COVID patients were 36% more likely to have long-term gastrointestinal problems than they did before the infection. 9,605 of them experiencing issues affecting the digestive system, intestines, pancreas, or liver. That was out of 154,000 patients who were studied. Are you seeing these long-lasting symptoms? And it seems like there's still just so much we don't know about long COVID. Dr. Sachs?
Well, absolutely. And one thing that is clear is that the people most likely to get long COVID, especially debilitating long COVID, are those who have the most severe initial infection. And those severe initial infections occurred predominantly in 2000 and 2001. So that created a whole population of people who really don't feel healthy at all, even though they've completely recovered from COVID-19. And one of the things that's really an important research agenda is how to manage people with persistent symptoms after they've recovered from COVID, because we still don't have a good approach to that. I will say on the bright side is that while long COVID still does happen with COVID-19 that occurs more recently, it's less common, and that's because the disease is less severe than it once was. Combination of vaccines and our infection-induced immunity has made COVID-19 a less threatening disease than it was, thank goodness, in 2020 and 2021.
Dr. Pierre, what would you say are the lessons that we learned over the last 3 years?
Well, there have been a lot. From where I sit, one of the more important ones is our community is key. I don't think we would have been where we were in our neighborhood, in the communities that we serve, without our community leaders, without having invested in ensuring that our messaging, our resources, our vaccines the science behind it was translated, the necessity was translated linguistically and culturally to the community at large. It was incredibly important to have them there. And so I think I would say that you worry about so many things slipping away, but that is one that I see enduring. We are really trying to center community in everything that we do, with the understanding that really any health outcomes we hope to have need to have individuals with the trust of the community behind them.
Dr. Sachs, what would you say the lessons are that we didn't learn over the last 3 years that we should have? Lessons we didn't learn. Well, one thing is that we really should understand that science, progress in science is a process. It's not like a light going on in a dark room. And we learn things incrementally. And so it is true that there might be revisions to recommendations. For example, the recommendations about vaccines, about masks, about whether to take drugs like Paxlovid, they might change as we learn more as we go along. And this doesn't mean that we're trying to mislead people. It just means that the science has changed. The data have given us an updated view. And I'm going to give an example right now. The treatment Paxlovid, which is very effective at helping keep people out of the hospital with COVID-19 is still very important for people who are vulnerable to severe COVID, and that be the older people or people who are immunocompromised. But it doesn't mean that everyone has to take it. And so right now, there really isn't a lot of evidence for giving it to young, healthy people. But that might change if we learn more about antiviral therapy and its potential benefits. So stay tuned and realize that science can be revised.
Okay. Dr. Pierre, are there other lessons that you wish we had learned that we haven't yet?
Oh, sure, absolutely. One big one is that we've talked so much about racial and ethnic health inequities, but I feel like with every emerging infectious disease or disease, we still remain surprised to see these gaps in health outcomes. And so although we've talked the talk, we haven't really made a point with each emerging new infection to center how information is shared, how underlying health beliefs and communication channels can impact the health outcomes in Black and Brown communities that have been systemically marginalized. So I think that's a big one, and one that really we have to do a lot more work on.
Okay. Dr. Sachs, what can we look forward to here, both in terms of COVID and other infections? I know that, right now, antibiotic-resistant Shigella is a concern that's starting to spread. What do you expect to see going forward?
Well, one thing that I want to underscore is that the research on treating COVID isn't done, and recently I heard a very interesting clinical trial on treatment of COVID with another antiviral, not Paxlovid, but one very much like it, which showed pretty convincingly that if you then interviewed people who got that treatment 3 and 6 months later, they had a lower risk of developing the symptoms of long COVID. So that's the kind of progress I look forward to. As far as other things like antibiotic resistance, I just want to put a pitch in for our specialty. For those doctors out there who are wondering what to do, this is in a very exciting field. It is never boring. I can't say that either one of us has been bored a single moment in the last 3 years. And I'm pretty sure that's going to be true for the rest of my career.
I expect it will be. Dr. Paul Sachs and Dr. Cassandra Pierre, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
That's it for tonight. But come back tomorrow. U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts Rachel Rollins joins us on the heels of her trip to Selma, Alabama, to mark the 58th anniversary of the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thanks for watching. I'm Craig Lamolt. Good night.
One autumn morning.